And we're back because we have had a little bit of a hiatus when some time off over Christmas, other things happening in our lives, you know, but Proust has not stopped. We are continuing to develop some aspects of the back office. And the big news, Rob, do you want to kind of a fanfare just to kind of announce where we're up to with the company?
I think it was important that we had some foundations with which to move forward on Proust, especially if we're looking at actually re-engaging in publishing work and whatnot. So we have created a company. It is a company limited by guarantee, and it's called Proust Community Limited. So that's now registered at Companies House and is real. And we are in the process of setting up a bank account. We've already stumbled on that one once, and that's because I live in Jersey, which means I'm offshore, which means that the UK banks can't do any credit checks on me, and therefore immediately run away because I'm avoiding tax or something horrible like that. But the reality is we are able to move forward on that. We've got some support from other people to help us with that one. So that is again a really important step. It's very dull and really quite boring and not something Chris and I move towards. I think we run away from that sort of thing. However, it's important that we have these things in place which will enable Proust to go on the next step of its journey. So it's exciting, even if a little bit dull. Yeah. Can it be dull and exciting at the same time? I'm not
no.
Sure.
We've also got a few other things in the pipeline. A new Lent series is about to kick off, which we will do a daily Lent post. I've been talking as well to somebody who's involved in the Abbey of the Arts about partnering on some of that process, and so some of the work they're doing is amazing. So I'm looking forward to aspects of that. We've got poetry and video and things already starting to gather for that. We're also talking about another Proust meetup in the autumn time, so watch out for that. Hopefully we'll be able to get some more artists together to do some arty activism and things around that. But enough business. Let's talk about our guest today, Josie Gwin. Josie and I met at an Iona Community gathering in York last year. I was there as part of the new members intake into the Iona Community. And I suddenly found myself listening to somebody who spoke language of sociology that I'd kind of left behind in my, how many decades ago from my social sciences studies. That made so much sense to me in the work that she was doing, and I thought immediately there's a huge resonance with that work, with the sort of project that we're involved in with Proust, and I thought we really need to learn more about this and talk more about this, and so here we are. So I'm going to hand over to Rob, and Rob and Josie are going to talk a little bit about her journey, about how she ended up in Edinburgh from the States, all sorts of other things around that. So on you go, you two.
Thank you. Well, welcome, Josie, and thank you so much for spending this time with us this morning. I wonder, maybe just for the listeners now, you could just give us a brief intro as to who you are and where you come from, please.
Well, it's, that's kind of depends on what decade you're talking about. But in short, I'm American, living in Edinburgh, and grew up in a conservative Christian evangelical background. Spent a good amount of time in and out of evangelical spaces in my childhood. Actually helped to plant an evangelical Presbyterian church when my husband and I were first married, and also spent a good amount of time engaging with and caring for people who were going through difficult life experiences. We lived in Southeast Asia for a period of time when I was a child. My parents started an international NGO providing an early childhood education for children from the slums of the Philippines. So it was something that I was around from a very young age in just being exposed to people who were experiencing struggle and suffering and loss and grief. And so when my husband and I got married, we got married very young, and he also was around a community of people who were going through suffering and loss. His father was a conservative, so is a conservative pastor, was a pastor for the deaf community. So he was in a community that was really experiencing marginalization and oppression and working through kind of these various crises in unique ways in their life. When we first got married, we went to work for a conservative Christian ministry. It was a summer camp, and they would often bring up children from underserved areas, underserved communities. And at that time, my husband also became a firefighter. So we were, caring for traumatized people in our community. He was responding to emergencies and crises as, we were caring for these kids that were coming up and participating in this camp. So we really saw a need to build out opportunities to come alongside people in creative ways. Yeah. At that time, I was really involved in horses and kind of the agricultural community, and we saw the impact that horses could have in individuals' lives and the lives of families. So we started an equine therapy program. At that time frame, I also became a firefighter. So again, kind of seeing those the need to have people who are willing to respond when crisis happened, and then the need for tools that would help to support people as they negotiate recovery. Yeah. So that led into some first responder chaplaincy, kind of creating some workshops, trainings for communities, for our fellow first responders, which over a series of time evolved into humanitarian aid and disaster response chaplaincy. So bringing back in that international component that I had grown up with. And as we continue to build out these tools, we just saw the need for preparatory resilience. There was a huge gap in the preparatory piece. The crisis care component was happening, but we just didn't see communities or individuals or organizations developing resilience tools prior to an event happening. And we were working so much with faith-based communities. There was an observation that many people were expressing experiences of fracturing in their concept of God in their theological beliefs as they were experiencing these crises. Their worldview had been shattered, and that was deeply affecting their resilience. And they weren't seeing faith communities come alongside them and support them. They were feeling alone in negotiating their trauma. So that kind of led me to start exploring, what does this mean? Like, how is this informing people's resilience? And that essentially led me into research.
Sorry, but can you help us understand what you mean by resilience, please?
Sure. It's become such a buzzword, and I think it's tossed out in so many different contexts. I mean, everything from environmental resilience to financial resilience, that we've kind of lost a grasp of what does this mean to who we are as human beings. And resilience actually came out of the sciences. It was something that came out of physics, and essentially was a way of trying to define how metals responded to stress. And the terminology that came around it was bouncing back. So when a metal would actually return to its previous state, it was termed resilient. Well, unfortunately, then that was applied to human beings when it started to enter the psychosocial space or the psychological space. And, human beings don't respond like metal. We don't bounce back when events happen, like we're irrevocably changed by these things. So the field of research has had to examine then, well, how is resilience defined? And unfortunately, they haven't come up with a definition that encapsulates the concept. They're still exploring it. So there's various core components that we can say this is what resilience means, but there's not a full definition that says, okay, well, this is what resilience is to an individual or community. So resilience is adaptable, it's flexible, it's collaborative, it's relational. It's something that when we go through an event, it's something we draw from. It's not built in an event. It can be built after an event once restorative recovery has begun to occur. But it's something that is inherent to who we are. We're born with resilience, and we can develop it as we go through life. So we really kind of term it as like tools in a toolbox. Your resilience is your toolbox, and resilience is what you draw from that contributes to restorative recovery, which then provides the opportunity for ongoing human flourishing. And so some of these misconceptions around resilience, like pushing through, bouncing back, kind of muscling it out, none of those are resilient, because those are not things that
that's
lead
helpful
to human flourishing.
Yeah, so it isn't. I'm glad you said that. So it's not about bad things, stopping bad things from happening, or things that affect us negatively, I suppose. It's not about just gutsing through it, and it's not about constant bouncing back. It's about something you're drawing from, like you said, a toolbox of skills or techniques. Is it? I don't know.
It's an aspect of how we negotiate events. So challenging events are going to happen in life. Like there's no getting around that. We all experience difficult things. How we negotiate those experiences is our resilience. So sometimes we come across people who think, well, because this is really affecting me, this event is really affecting me, I must not be resilient. It's affecting you because you're human. How you pull from your toolbox is what determines how you're going to negotiate that. And that's what frames your resilience. So we want to kind of put this in what my husband and I, through our work, often term a nouning category. So we either are or are not resilient. But resilience is a verb. It's something that ebbs and flows, and that's a natural part of the human experience. But because we're so focused on, are we succeeding in something, we want to be able to, kind of champion, I am resilient. It's like, you are resilient, 100%. And that's not tied to whether or not you're struggling in this situation or not. What determines your resilience is what tools you have at your disposal. And if you identify gaps in your toolbox, how you access tools that will then allow you to move forward in restorative ways. That's what determines your resilience.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I'm sure we'll explore that more a little bit later on, I'm sure. What I also wanted to ask you is, how did you come across, you met Chris at an Iona gathering. I'm interested to know, are you a member of the Iona community, or was this part of another reason you were there?
Yes, I'm not a member of the Iona community. I'm doing my PhD at the University of Edinburgh. As part of kind of my journey and kind of understanding what contributes to resilience, what restorative practices are helpful for communities, exploring these kind of concepts of hierarchy and holism, I came across the Iona community as an identified holistic community. And a component of looking at faith and spirituality was examining the state of the institutional church, which as an American, obviously the US church is kind of forefront on my mind, but looking at the global church kind of through the work that we do, and considering what are some different ways maybe of doing church. And by church, I mean church as like the global church, and kind of the church is more of a communal aspect and less of a institutional structure or business structure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in looking at these concepts, I wanted to examine a community that was working to do faith and spirituality in a different way, that was working to do communal practices of faith and spirituality in a different way, which is how I came across the Iona community. So I initially thought I would be looking at two different communities, one structured hierarchical, one structured holistic, until I realized that the Iona community has a historical trajectory of both. They started out in a hierarchical format, deeply connected to the Church of Scotland,
Okay.
and then moved in a holistic way. So that allowed me to examine them as a case study for my PhD research.
Okay. So I don't know if you want to touch on this now, Chris, but my next obvious question was, you've spoken to us about how your work you said your research informs your work, which informs your research. And I'm really interested in, I think what we'd really like to talk about is what resilience looks like in a community.
Well,
I think
can I suggest then that, Rob, can I suggest is that you hold that thought then, because I think I am definitely going to be heading in that direction too.
Go on.
So yeah.
Well, why don't you? Because I think we should talk about the meat.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. I suppose looking at Josie's CV, there's an awful lot of other things we could talk about, and equine therapy and firefighting and all the other things that you've done. So and also about the work of the resilience kind of organization, and the fact that you're reestablishing that over here. We might touch on that again at the end. But I guess I mentioned earlier my kind of my sociological kind of it's almost like archaeology of my sociology, to be honest. It's so long ago. Was so much triggered by hearing you speak. What I remember about the way that the sociology that I was learning dealt with the religion, it had these two polarities. It had the Durkheim functionalism of anomie and the way that religion can solidify and help us integrate and all that kind of stuff. And it had Marx as the opium of the people, religion being the enemy, and so the prevention of our actualization. All that, and those two polarities were the compare and contrast standard essay for any A-level sociology, let alone degree-level stuff. So I know that the research has moved on a lot since then. I've occasionally dipped into it over the years, and the interesting thing is the degree to which sociologists are identifying the value of faith-based practices, of faith-based communities, and how they contribute to well-being, to resilience, to all of those good things that we long for. So I wonder if you can kind of take us on a bit of a journey through some of that thinking now, and how much things have changed in the decades since I've looked in textbooks.
I'm not a sociologist. I do integrate sociology into my work. I also integrate psychology, theology, maybe a touch of anthropology here and there. So I'm very much an interdisciplinary researcher. But the field of resilience research, which is relatively new, builds on sociology, but really is only about 40 years old as far as the psychosocial aspect of resilience. But as there has become a need to examine what it means to move through difficult circumstances restoratively, resilience research has pulled from all of these different fields. And one of the things I think that's really interesting about some of the recent findings is that we've observed that in many ways our world has moved in a more individualistic direction. So we've had less of a focus on kind of the communal engagement and more of an individualistic perspective. And we see that play out in a variety of spaces, not the least of which is the secularization of various cultures and this kind of self-assessment of what it means to be connected to religion. And so, in sociology, when Goffman and Durkheim were writing, in the early days of sociology as kind of fathers of sociology, and identifying the value of religious practices in some cases, in some writings, but the value is that part is part of what drives people in community. We still see that today. So people find commonality with people who believe in similar ways that they do. What we've found through the individualistic movement of global society is that things like our neighbor and things like community, or words like that, concepts like that, are being redefined. So it used to be, 100 years ago when sociologists were first writing, our community was who was in our immediate proximity. Right? So we were physically connected to our neighbor and our community. So when we interacted with each other, we have this ability to assess our physiological response, our psychological response, our emotional response. And Durkheim writes about kind of an energy that occurs in that connection, and he calls it an effervescent energy. So when we connect with people we have things in common with, at a subconscious and often a conscious level, we identify these commonalities. But then it's actually our differences and the ways that we engage differently and value those differences that continues to drive connection and drives depth of connection. And I'll come back to that in just a second. So today, in our modern day, we may not even know our neighbor. So our neighbors, our physical proximity and what we used to consider our community, but we may never even have met our neighbor. We leave our boxes that we live in and we get in our boxes that we drive in and we go to our boxes that we work in, and we don't necessarily interact with the people in the boxes next to us. Our community could be globally located. Our community may not be even who we're in physical proximity with. So the ways that we connect in community has fundamentally shifted. And that informs how we engage with religious practices, how we engage with faith and spirituality. Faith and spirituality, resilience research continues to demonstrate, is core to who we are as human beings. It doesn't determine a specific faith and spirituality or specific kind of religion, but just an understanding or an exploration of something bigger than ourselves, however we define that. We might define that as the divine or the sacred or God, or it might even be defined as something more ethereal than that, just kind of our connection to something bigger than ourselves. So when we come into contact with people that have that kind of sense of commonality of belief, that starts to drive connection. And then it's through ongoing connections, which are often put in a category of ritual, that deepen that relationship. So anytime we connect with another individual, there's a chain that's built. And there's a sociologist, a more recent sociologist, Randall Collins, who's termed that as an interaction ritual chain. So when we interact with somebody, we start to build a connection with them. There's a level of energy, Goffman's energy, that comes into play there. As we continue to connect with individuals or community, that energy is refueled and rebuilt. And that's something that actually informs our resilience, because it's that energy that we often will draw from when we go through difficult circumstances. And there's ways that energy informs different tools that we kind of put in our resilience toolbox. But those rituals then continue to build that energy. When we're in a faith and spirituality space, there's some rituals that are inherent to that, right? I mean, there's religious practices that are a ritual by themselves, but there's various things that we don't necessarily consider ritual that are. So if we meet a friend at the same coffee shop every Saturday, and we meet them every Saturday at 9 a.m. And we have kind of this basic process that we go through, like greeting each other. How was your week? These are the things that are going on. That's a ritual. When we pass our neighbor bringing out our bins in the morning, every Tuesday morning at 6 a.m., that's a ritual. And those are those things that establish that sense of connection. And then how that connection is carried on is what determines whether or not we will feel a sense of connection and belonging to the community that we're a part of, to the individuals that we may or may not be in physical proximity to. So it's really interesting to kind of see how sociology has evolved a bit over, the past 100 years, and how it's evolved in connection to things like resilience and in connection to how our global society has shifted.
Can we just dig a little bit more into that then, Josie? Because I'm hearing you describe sort of resilience and this effervescence that's going back to the Goffman stuff, always in the context of community and interaction rather than individual practices. And so the research, such as particularly Collins' research that you're describing, the sort of the good stuff that happens through kind of religion, is that mappable because of the degree of which it connects us as individuals, or does spiritual belief have a vital component to that? Or, can you say, for example, that most of it is just about the deepening of interaction one with another, or can you say that actually no, it has to, the spiritual component of that connection is the turbocharger. That's the thing that really matters. Is it possible to distinguish those two?
It's really a yes and. So interestingly, one of the gaps in the field of resilience research that's just now being addressed is that it initially came from a very individualistic perspective. What makes an individual resilient? And part of that assessment did identify the value of faith and spirituality, the value of an individual understanding of something bigger than ourselves. So resilient people have a willingness to explore an understanding of something bigger than themselves. And that can play out in a variety of ways, including specific structured religious practices, but also just kind of a willingness to self-assess and explore the inner world. But they kept running into these roadblocks that only took them so far from the individual side. And it continued to circle back around to, well, no man is an island. So if we're only assessing our individual aspects, we're ignoring this whole category of social connection. We're ignoring this whole category of social support. And when we're looking at these exponential rates of loneliness and reported mental health issues, then maybe that gap is this breakdown of the social support system, this disconnect of the social aspect. And so we really need to be examining how is that occurring, and how does that inform resilience? How does that inform connection? Despite the secularization of society, as I mentioned before, most people still find commonality around a sense of spirituality or religious practices. And as that secularization has occurred,
is that even in the UK?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, it is.
Oh, right, that's an interesting kind of statement. So you're saying that despite the continuing decline, I think the latest statistics I saw, less than 10% of people in the UK will be attending church even over a calendar year. So despite that, people's still main way of connecting with other people is spiritual. Say more about that.
Yeah, so interestingly, despite the rising rates of secularization and disconnection with the institutional church, the reported rates of people's sense of spirituality is actually increasing. So what that's telling us is that people are not finding a connection with their faith and spirituality within the institutional church. There's some aspect of that structure that's failing them. And there's a host of reasons for that, not the least of which actually is the political connection between nationalism or religious nationalism and the institutional church. So people are saying, I'm showing up at this church, maybe even my family has been a part of for generations, or it's been something that's inherent to my community, and my spiritual needs are not being connected here. That energy, that effervescent energy that's driving a sense of connection and belonging, I'm not finding it in this space. So I'm going to go find a space where I am finding that. So people are finding that in a connection with the natural world. They're finding that in other groups that drive commonality. So they're seeing a sense of spirituality in a relational connection, maybe even a run group that they go to, where they say, this is actually where I feel the most human, where I feel a sense of connection and belonging. And that's actually something that's touching my sense of sacredness as a human being. And it's not in the institutional church. So there's an interest and a drive towards spirituality, but there's a decline in connection to formal religious structures.
That's absolutely fascinating.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah, on you go.
Well, no, it's just that I think we've heard previous podcasts very similar points that people are finding community in different places. But I just wanted to. It makes me wonder whether society needs to relearn how to be community. If we've been individualistic for 75 years or something after the war and so on, does society now need to learn how to be community again? And by that I mean, is there a sense of obligation on me to know my neighbour, even in some sense? Is it not good enough for me to seek out my community, which is virtual, if you like? It's disparate, it's all over the place. Do I have any sense of obligation that I need to commune with my community?
Yeah. Well, if you carry on conversation with me for any length of time, you'll hear me repeat this often, but it's really a yes and. So we live in it. we live in a different society structure than we ever have been, and there's various ways that there needs to be a sense of intentionality in evolving into the social structure that we exist in. And that social structure has changed so quickly, particularly over the last couple of decades, that we haven't caught up yet. What will keep our communities resilient is that level of intentionality in engaging in these connections, these interaction ritual chains that do connect us to other human beings. So we live in a global society, we live in a media society that's working very, very hard to other people, to create these groups that, this dynamic of us versus them. And the only way that we can resist that is if we continue to say all human beings are sacred and valuable. And that doesn't matter if it's my neighbor. It doesn't matter if it's somebody on the other side of the world that I used to know really well, but now I only converse with, through chat, once every other month. Those connections are important and they contribute to our resilience. So when I engage in a WhatsApp chat with a friend, maybe from high school, that all I really engage with or keep track of is through social media, and that's how I stay up to date on their life, that is an interaction ritual chain. It's a different one than the one that I do when I walk downstairs in my flat to, take my dog outside for a walk and run into my neighbor. But those interaction ritual chains are important. And when that energy drives a sense of connection and belonging, that contributes to our resilience. But because we live in a world that's very intentional about creating an other, about creating an us versus them, we have to meet that with intentional resistance that says, I'm not going to allow you to other people. I'm going to see others as sacred. I'm going to see others as equally valuable as myself. And because of that, I'm going to be intentional about the interaction rituals I engage in a way that is a reciprocal energy. It fuels their sense of connection and belonging as it fuels my own.
Beautiful. Before we leave behind this research, the research base, then it's probably worth mentioning, in case people don't know, just how stark this benefit that researchers found of that, a spiritual community connection has been shown to be. It's kind of effect on suicide rates, on mental health issues, on marriage, on job satisfaction, all sorts of kind of strange spin-offs. I mean, I don't know whether you've got those statistics in your mind. I don't have them in my mind anymore, but it is quite remarkable what the research is showing about the benefits of these faith-based communities. I think I'm right in saying.
No, that's exactly right. Again, the resilience research is demonstrating that a concept of faith and spirituality or sacredness is inherent to resilient people. And resilient people negotiate the challenges of life in more restorative ways. And as we kind of consider, this, what contributes to resilience, what we've really observed is that you can really approach it from a holistic assessment lens. There's 4 core relationships that are inherent to resilience. It's an understanding of ourself, the value of ourself, a relationship with ourself, and self-awareness. And there's a lot of Western research that focuses, like I said earlier, on the individual and on the self. And so as part of that, what's happened then is some of these other 3 core relationships have been kind of disintegrated off or siloed off, but they're just as important and valuable. And that one of those relationships is what I've already mentioned, which is a concept of the divine or the sacred or spirituality. The other relationship is our connection to other people, so community, and community encapsulates all things. It can be our physical proximity community. It can be somebody on the other side of the world. But then the 4th relationship that we often forget about is our connection to the natural world. And all 4 of those are vital. And there's various fields of research that emphasize how important all 4 relationships are. and at a holistic level. There's various sacred writings that touch on the body, mind, heart, and soul, and we want to break those off. Medical only deals with the body, and psychological only deals with the mind, and emotional only deals with the heart. So we are whole beings, and the only way that we can continue to move forward in restorative ways is to encapsulate body, mind, heart, and soul, these 4 key relationships. When we do that, what we're finding is that people are moving through crises and traumatic events in ways that contribute deeply to this sense of human flourishing and connection. So it's where there's gaps in those relationships that we start to see these ongoing impacts, where we start to see people really fracture and disintegrate. But when we've got these 4 relationships that are reciprocal in their connection, we're really seeing the reciprocal effect of that. Human beings are individually healthier, but communities are as well. And that's where, then people are engaging with the natural world from a perspective of stewardship and care, where people are engaging with their faith and spirituality. They all inform each other. It's not one more so than the other. It's that they're all vitally important.
That's really helpful. Yeah, thank you.
It is.
Just in terms of the nature of these communities, then we were touching earlier. I think what we had a rough conclusion already, that not all faith-based communities are equal in the benefit that they give you or they bring to us in terms of resilience or anything else. So I'm just wondering whether, feel free to bring in the specifics, if you like, of the Iona research you did, the Iona Community research. But what are we seeing then about what makes particular communities more resilient, particular faith-based communities more resilient or more helpful to those connections that you described?
That's such a great question. It's core to my research, which is recognizing, some of the conceptual words that we assigned to resilience at the beginning of the conversation, which were, flexible, adaptive, collaborative. Those are the same things that apply to resilient communities. So a resilient community, through my research, communities that negotiate these challenges, and that can be a natural disaster, that can be a crisis that's internal to the community. Maybe it's a leadership betrayal. We've certainly seen that in various faith-based spaces that can devastate a community. Maybe it's a loss of somebody that was significant in the community. Communities that negotiate those things are communities that are curious, they're collaborative, they're diverse, they're inclusive, they're flexible. The communities that fracture and break are communities that are rigid, that are power over driven, that have a formulaic approach to life. So when we see those communities, it's those communities, their formula, when it meets life and the events of life, it can't flex around it. It inevitably fractures. It fractures somewhere. Now, it might fracture completely apart, or it might fracture just in various small spaces. But it's those fractures that cause harm to the individuals that are a part of that community. When a community is flexible and adaptable and collaborative, then they can come together around these different events with asking the question of, what can we do in this space? What is available to us? The rigid communities come at a crisis or an event of, this is what we have to do. And when they come at an event with, this is what we have to do, it inevitably leaves people out. And that formula will never encapsulate the complexity of an event. It will never fully address the effect of that event on everybody that's involved in that. So those are the communities that we see implode, that we see disintegrate, are those that carry a very rigid formulaic perspective.
That's really interesting. You were mentioning that's clearly shown in the research as well, which I'm intrigued by, just the way that you can map the sort of the more kind of fundamentalist, I suppose we would say, communities are less resilient. That is effectively what you're saying. Is that right?
It really is. I mean, when people approach a situation or a crisis or a disaster with, this is the way that we've always done it. We believe that this is the right way to do things. And that can be theological beliefs, that can be, a formulaic psychological approach. It never meets the reality of life, never does. So it's the flexible, adaptable, curious, reciprocal perspectives that then have the ability to shape to the context. So through the charity work that I do, we lead a lot of workshops, and we open every single one with, these are concepts. And when you teach in concepts, those concepts can flex to the context. And that doesn't matter if that's a cross-cultural context. It doesn't matter if it's a translation context, theological context, whatever. It can flex to that. When you come in with a formulaic context, there will always be outliers. You will never be able to reach everybody with that aspect. And so that's where we find things breaking down. Because life is not a formula. Life is something that ebbs and flows and changes. The most constant thing is change. So we can't meet change with a formula. It's never going to meet it.
Yeah. Okay. Just in terms of your research with the Iona community, then, I suppose from a perfectly selfish point of view, given that I am involved with I am part of the Iona community, were there any surprises in that? Or, are you just finding the story that you've just outlined, just kind of, was your research just confirming the elements of that? Or were there particular kind of parts of your research that said, no, that's interesting, that's taking us in new areas, or making me think about things in different ways?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. There's been multiple surprises along the way. I think one of the key aspects, that any researcher has to address is what kind of biases are you bringing into the research, and how willing are you to identify and address your bias? And coming from the background that I came from, which is call myself a survivor of patriarchy, a survivor of conservative evangelicalism, which I'm not part of anymore. I had a bias against hierarchy. So in my mind, hierarchy is always negative. There's it's always power over, it's always fear driven. And in digging deeper into the research and identifying, actually, there's social hierarchies that are inherent to our world in general. We have hierarchies of a parent-child, a student-teacher, our teacher-student, that are built into the way that society is structured. So hierarchy is not always negative. There's a hierarchy that can actually be a form of empowerment's kind of a cliche word, but it can actually empower people. The term, a gal that is core to my research, a sociologist, a futurist by the name of Rianne Eisler, she uses this term, hierarchy of actualization. So it's actually a hierarchy that comes alongside somebody and helps them be able to actualize the best parts of who they are as a human being. So, I have 4 children. I think about that from parenting perspective. Like, my job as a parent is to come alongside each of my kids, 3 of them are adults now, and be able to walk through life together, actualizing the best parts of who we are as humanity. Mm-hmm. But when hierarchy comes in this power over aspect, it undermines the best parts of who we are. And it pushes us into this formula that's rigid and doesn't hold up. So that was a surprise at the beginning. And as I kind of looked at the Iona community and the trajectory that the community has in its historic legacy, it's founding in this very kind of strict, rigid structure that was the Church of Scotland. It's founding in a time of global trauma. So post-World War, pre-Second World War, there's value in clearly defined structures for traumatized individuals. Our mind seeks predictability, it seeks consistency, that all of society was in upheaval at the time that the Iona community was founded. And so there was this kind of sense or drive of like, how can we rebuild community in a way that's restorative? And you can see how people were drawn to that. You can see how people wanted to be a part of something that felt consistent and predictable, particularly at the time. And then over the past 90 years, as the community has had different people come in, drawn by commonality, but then their differences have influenced the community and shaped the community has chosen to respond to that with curiosity, flexibility, adaptability, and collaboration, which is part of the reason why the community is at the holistic level that it is today, because it's been willing to evolve. It's been willing to say, we're going to engage with all of these people from a perspective that they have something sacred and valuable to contribute to the conversation. Then you look at some of these other rigid structures that were around at the same time, who said, we're not going to engage with curiosity and collaboration. Like, this is what, we're telling you it is. It is this structure and nothing else. Well, what's still around? I mean, at a very basic level, what still exists? And I think something that's also been surprising is that hierarchy and holism will always continue to coexist in the same space. So we've got these natural hierarchies, but because we're human beings, those power over hierarchies are always going to try to insert their way, right? And the Iona community is not exempt from that. None of our relationships are exempt from that, right? There's various ways that we'll come across individuals who will try to insert some kind of power over dynamic into the situation. And the bottom line is that breaks interaction ritual chains. So whether or not a community remains resilient is how they respond to power dynamics, what they do when that power over hierarchy inserts itself and tries to demand its way. How they respond to that will determine how they move forward into the future.
This is so fascinating, and to be honest, I could spend hours just talking to you about this, but I guess we're not talking about the community. We're talking about Proust. So I guess at the end of this, and bringing Rob back in as well to this discussion, I suppose the interesting thing that we have is what does Proust as a redeveloping in its second coming, what can we learn from this research in the way that we shape ourselves, the way that we, obviously probably the first thing for us to think about is this word ritual, and how art and art making and art engaging forms, are those two synonymous, or is there a difference between ritual and art in this kind of way of understanding its value?
Like I mentioned earlier, anything can be a ritual. So it's simply how that's structured and how that brings us together around a point of commonality. One of the amazing things about art is that the act of creating is something that's so distinctly and uniquely human. It's something that we can come together around. It's something that drives a sense of awe and wonder. It creates a place of beauty. And those are things that we resonate with others who are experiencing art. And it's that energy as we experience that together that can drive a sense of connection and belonging if we continue to press into that with curiosity. So where, like I mentioned earlier, where interaction ritual chains break down is where there's a insertion of a power dynamic where maybe somebody's trying to tell you what this art means and insist that you think of this art in a certain way, as opposed to remaining together in the space with curiosity and delight. That it's the awe, wonder, and delight that feeds that sense of sacred. It is that aspect of creating art that fuels our spirituality, and vice versa. Our spirituality fuels our art. When we're drawing from that sense of sacred is usually when we are at our most creative. My husband's the artist. He's a poet, does pencil sketching and oils, and it just has a deeply, deeply artistic view on the world. I tend to be more pragmatic, but the way that I create is by cooking, by creating hospitable spaces, by creating relationship. That's a form of art, and it's a form of art that brings people together. So when that energy is created around art, then that drives that sense of connection and belonging. And when we are intentional about creating various practices or flexible structures, as you will, around our art, we really can drive a depth of community that's deeply impactful for people. So even by creating a network like you have through Proust, you are creating a ritual. You're creating an opportunity for people to regularly gather together with intentionality around something that's unique and creative, that can contribute a sense of awe and wonder. And that drives belonging in a world that desperately is looking for connection and belonging.
I suppose
there
just
need to be a core value? Sorry, does there need to be a core value that people, a community, holds on to? Even if there's just one tiny thing. Does a community have to agree on at least one thing, and then be, I don't know, all those words we're talking, adaptive and flexible? Does there have to be some core thing that they believe in, if you like?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, it's the commonalities that bring us together. So when, I guess I would say in a manner of speaking, there is a core thing. Does it have to be a core thing? I think that's the hinge question. In various faith-based spaces we've been a part of, that there is an aspect of discussion of the question of how are we defining what we believe, and are we unified around what we believe? And that can become a bit of a slippery slope, because it can lead into creating a formula. It can lead into saying we all have to agree on these things. What we continue to encourage is for communities to identify the things that they have in common, but just the things that are what is. Celebrate that. Don't dictate that, but celebrate the things that you have in common. And then identify the ways that you're different and unique, and celebrate that. So if you come into a community or come into contact with a community and you have nothing in common with that community, you're not going to develop these interaction ritual chains that contribute a sense of energy and connection and belonging. And that's okay. You'll move on to a community that you have a sense of commonality with. Like, that's just life. We come into contact with groups of people or individuals that we realize we have nothing in common with. We're not going to have a sense of connection if we don't have a sense of commonality. Where we err is when we insist on homogeneity. So when we insist our communities become homogenous, because those are the communities that fracture. We lose our adaptability, we lose our diversity, because we're no longer celebrating difference. And that applies, very distinctly to our state of affairs, geopolitical state of affairs in the world, where we're seeing different rhetoric that's insisting on homogenous communities. And what's going to happen is that we're undermining our own resilience. We're hamstringing ourselves by insisting on homogenous communities.
I heard somebody say recently that nothing unites like making a majority feel that they're under threat by a minority, I suppose, in this instance. And I guess that there is that driver towards communities of division, and communities that are defined against a set of values. And I certainly feel that within both the Iona community and my own experience. There are red lines for me, that there are political views, there are religious views, which I can't be around. And I try my hardest to relax to those things and try not to kind of allow the barricades to become too great. But I make art that kind of is deliberately oppositional. So is there a relationship there between the prophetic call towards justice, I suppose, as I would put it? But then I would say that because the things that I think are important. Is there a relationship between that, or a dissonance between that and the sort of community making you're describing? That there's those lovely things of being curious and willing to tolerate variety and difference, which are also principles which I love. But I think there's a hard edge to that for me, which I often struggle with.
No, that's such a great point, and goes back to a yes and. So there's an important aspect of considering the structures of community, the commonalities and difference, and the value of boundaries. So we can consider somebody a sacred, valuable individual and not spend time with them, because for our own sake or the relational aspect of our community, this individual is not a safe person to have as part of our boundaries of community. Now, where again we kind of cross that boundary is when we start dehumanizing that individual. So we can still carry a humanizing aspect, a sense of sacred value over somebody that we deeply, deeply disagree with, and can assess this is not a safe individual that within my personal space, within my communal space. This is something, their beliefs or their practices are something that I need to speak out against. And when we humanize, when we create, when we are curious, those are all acts of resistance against what can be deeply disintegrative and destructive in our world. So when you know, as through the work that I do or through my research, I often come across situations where people are asking this question about boundaries. You know, if somebody has harmed me, but I still need to be, you know, curious, or I still need to be restorative, does that mean that I have to let anything go? And the answer to that is a hard no, 100% no.
Amen.
It's okay for your relationship with yourself, which needs to be restorative, your relationship with others, which needs to be restorative, your relationship with the natural world, your concept of the divine, which needs to be restorative, to say, I can't be in a space with this individual because this needs to be safe for all of us, including myself. Considering it's all of those things intersected. We so easily end up in these binary categories. Like it's an either or. You know, if I'm curious and I'm engaging and I'm moving in restorative ways, then that means I like all things have to be okay. And the answer is no, they don't, because then that's not restorative for me. If I'm observing somebody who's dehumanizing, if I'm observing somebody who's causing harm to somebody else, then what creates safety for myself and other people is to stand up and go, stop it. Like, that's not okay. And that's actually what's creating safety for them, because dehumanizing undermines our resilience. So when we act in dehumanizing ways towards somebody else, we actually are impacting our own soul. We're impacting our own relationship with ourselves as we're fracturing our relationship with other people. So in many ways, standing up with this prophetic statement of this is not okay, you have to stop it, is actually what's more restorative for that individual who's perpetrating those acts. Now, they can choose not to change anything. They can choose to continue to dehumanize. They're going to continue to harm themselves. What you're providing is an opportunity for them to wake up and stop harming themselves. If they're not willing to do that, then you're creating a sense of safety for yourself and your community by saying, you can't do that here. You can make that choice. You have the freedom as a sacred, valuable individual, but you need to do that choice somewhere else. And hopefully they'll come.
That's a really important distinction, and really well put, Josie. I love that. Thank you so much. Rob, anything else from you then, in terms of, as we start to kind of think about, we're about an hour of our recording now, so flown by.
No, this is there's a real sense for me that this could be a two-parter. There's so much this conversation about community and how communities work and it develop and grow and thrive. For me, it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And the practices that an intentional community need to sort of instill, if you like, just that conversation we've just had about the person who constantly dehumanizes, giving them the opportunity and the environment where they can choose, not just dismissing someone, but simply giving them the opportunity, but at the same point, making it clear, it would appear, that there are consequences to your behavior. And at some point, the behavior, you can go and you choose to go and demonstrate that behavior somewhere else. Fascinating.
Yeah, the other thing that's occurred to me just in this the back end of this conversation is that I suppose Proust we have lots of our community are very much still activists within traditional churches, and there are people like me who no longer are involved in those structures, and so I think without ever fully kind of talking it through, we've accepted that it's, as you would say, it's both and. But actually, when you conceptualize the difference between the hard-edged version of those churches and the generative, flexible, kind of open, what's the curious? I think that word you used as well, which I really like. Spaces. Yeah. It immediately occurs to me that they're the people that we are privileged to be working alongside of. Those people that are still within those spaces, pursuing that kind of way of collectivizing, and boy, how much we need those people. So it's been really helpful to hear you describe that as well.
All those voices are necessary in what we're experiencing in the world. We need the voices that are in different spaces, asking the question of what can we do different? How can we see this differently? What changes are possible? And addressing that, because the churches are made up of people, and they are structures, but they're structures that just encapsulate people, and those people are sacred and valuable as well. And continuing to provide the opportunity for a structure or system to change is really important, as are the voices that are outside of that. I'm not a part of an institutional church structure either, and there's a host of reasons for that, not the least of which is restorative care for myself. I'm not at a place where that's a safe place for me to be. And so I engage with my faith and spirituality in a very different way, and in a way that pushes into that possibility for something different. I would argue that the reformation of the church is already occurring. I don't know that when various stages of reformation in previous history, I don't think they, stood up and said, this is the Reformation. It was in hindsight, they looked back and went, oh, that was a reformation. Yes. And I would argue that that's what we're in right now, and that we have an opportunity through the ways that we act restoratively with ourselves, with others, with our concept of the divine, and with the natural world, to play such a key part of resistance in that reformation, because we're in a world that wants to disintegrate, that wants to isolate, that wants to disrupt and destroy. And these ways of acting restoratively are such a vital part of resisting that. And it's what brings us together in ways that really life-giving and contribute to all of our human flourishing.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end than that. Thank you so much, Josie, for an absolutely brilliant, stimulating, and actually it just the way that we've been able to dip into a research space that is not commonly heard within religious spaces. I think that itself has been hugely beneficial and I hope it'll be interesting to lots of other people. I can't believe it won't be too. Yes. So thank you so much. No. And hopefully we'll talk again.
I really appreciate you having me on. It's just been a lovely conversation. I love what you're doing through Proust, and really excited to see how this community develops. I think there's just such a vital need for the beauty and wonder that art brings to the world, and how that creates such a great connection energy around that kind of community. So thank you for putting that together. I know that's not an easy process.
Thank you. Oh no, it's chaotic because we're chaotic.
Yes.
And we need help. So,
we do. Yes, that's the other thing. We need help.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop then and thank you again.